we are diving deep today into a story that it exists somewhere between forgotten history, a political flashpoint, and just a profound tragedy. For those who follow the edges of independent thought, of self-reliance, you know the name, San Aurelio.
You do.
This is that abandoned settlement deep in the Florida Everglades, and it's haunted by these rumors of lost gold. And it's defined, really, forever by that violent federal raid that happened nearly 2 decades ago.
And what's so fascinating here, I think, is that the official story, you know, the one about a tax-dodging cult, armed extremists, domestic terrorism, that was the narrative that was just, boom, immediately deployed and solidified. It stuck. And so our mission today is to move past that, you know, that single slick headline and really examine the facts as close as the source material allows us to.
Right.
We need to understand the meticulous, grueling process by which this really intensive experiment in radical self-reliance was built from nothing, from scratch, and then precisely how the external world chose to destroy it.
And we have some really remarkable material to work with here. This deep dive is built on years of investigative notes, forensic analysis of court documents, archived media footage, and crucially, protected interviews with key survivors.
People who were there.
People who were there, notably Ethan Brooks and Rachel Kim. And all of this, it provides this really dense, multi-layered view of a place most of us only know as a kind of cautionary tale.
Well, and the resilience of the legend itself, I mean, that speaks volumes about the community's impact, right? Even 2 decades later, we know that young men, they still trespass near the charred, flooded ruins.
Looking for the gold.
They're searching for the rumored treasure of San Aurelio. And the footage you see, it's grainy. It shows the skeletal church steeple and the half-collapsed water tower. They're just standing there like these grim monuments to this failure.
Yeah.
The author of our source material spent years, literally years, chasing these ghosts. And they concluded that what they found doesn't just challenge the official version, it, quote, tears it apart.
And that's our starting point. We aren't beginning with the siege. We're beginning with the motivation. Why did this specific group of, very diverse individuals, each of them successful in their own right, why did they want out so badly that they risked everything to build a parallel society in, like, the most hostile environment imaginable?
That's the question.
Let's zero in on that initial moment of defiance.
To really understand the intensity of San Aurelio, you have to understand the deep, specific wounds that were carried by its founders. This community, it wasn't built by, theoretical philosophers. It was built by people with fresh, very specific scars left by institutions they felt had betrayed them.
Let's start with Sarah Whitfield then. The sources label her the Seed, which is pretty powerful.
It is. She's introduced as this incredibly competent former corporate consultant. She worked for Arlington, the giant firm.
Right, razor sharp is the description.
Exactly. And she just walked away from all of it, decided to start a farm in rural Virginia.
And her big confrontation with the system, it wasn't some, dramatic shootout. It was, as the source says, death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts.
That's it, exactly. She wasn't an ideologue to start. She was a businesswoman who believed in local trade. She started selling raw milk, directly to customers who specifically wanted it.
An arrangement that had existed for generations.
For generations, quietly. It was a model of voluntary exchange. But then the state apparatus, it just zeroed in on her.
The rules started changing.
They changed, and they kept changing. She faced this relentless bureaucratic pressure. We're talking citations for unlabeled jars, fines because her refrigeration wasn't, compliant with some new code, endless disputes over minor building permits.
Just grinding her down.
The county insisted her septic tank needed an upgrade for commercial use, even though she was only serving a few dozen families. And she saw it not as public safety, but as a deliberate effort to make self-sufficiency prohibitively expensive, legally impossible.
And the culmination of that pressure was, it was truly devastating. It was this purely symbolic act of aggression.
The sources recount this very clearly. State inspectors, they cited environmental regulations over some minor runoff issue, a completely manufactured crisis, Sarah argued.
What did they do?
They brought in heavy machinery, they brought in bulldozers, and they flattened her custom-built greenhouses. Just bulldozed them. And Sarah told a local investigator at the time, she said, "This isn't about safety or compliance, it's about control. They can't tolerate the idea that I can feed myself and my neighbors without asking their permission first." That act, that aggressive institutional rejection, that was the catalyst for everything.
So given that, I mean, that's an immense professional and financial loss. Why double down on defiance in the Everglades? Why not just move to, say, Wyoming or Texas, a state that's known for being more permissive?
Right.
It wasn't trying to build a parallel economy inside the U.S., just fundamentally flawed from the start.
That's the critical analysis, isn't it? And for Sarah, she wasn't seeking less government. In her mind, she was seeking no external authority over voluntary exchange.
Wow.
Running away to another state with just a different set of political rules, for her, that was just trading one master for another. The Everglades, though, it was desolate. It was legally ambiguous because of all these abandoned land claims. It offered true separation.
And that resilience, that being, as the source says, burned but not broken, that's what attracted Ethan Brooks.
The muscle.
Yeah, the muscle. He was the classic definition of competence. 18 years in the Army infantry, trained, disciplined, but his breakdown was internal. It was about discovering the meaning of his sacrifice had just been hollowed out.
Exactly. His disillusionment was systemic. Towards the end of his active duty, he realized the focus of his tours, it had shifted. It wasn't about defending national interests anymore. It was about securing specific corporate contracts, safeguarding supply chains for private logistics firms.
Basically protecting corporate assets.
He called it bitterly bureaucracy with guns. And he returned home just unable to reconcile the rhetoric of service with that reality.
Which meant he couldn't fit back into civilian life.
He tried. He tried security jobs, working on fishing boats, but he just couldn't handle the hierarchy, the constant paperwork, the mundane politics of a corporate office. He found the civilian world was just as beholden to the systems he'd risked his life for.
So San Aurelio is a last resort for him.
He told the author that he joined not because he thought it was a guaranteed success, but because, for the first time in years, he wanted something to be worth defending again. His mission was focused, pragmatic. His words were, "I stayed to make sure no one messed with us."
So if Sarah and Ethan brought the sort of practical physical resistance, Gabriel Gabo Martinez, the voice, he provided the moral urgency, the deep, deep institutional distrust.
He did. He was a Cuban exile from Matanzas, and his scars were generational.
Right.
Gabo's perspective was unique because he had seen the endpoint of centralized control firsthand. He'd watched party elites drink imported French champagne, while ordinary Cubans waited in line for hours for, meager rations of bread.
And his parents?
His parents, who desperately wanted to join him in the U.S., they died from preventable illnesses, while their visa applications just sat stalled in bureaucratic purgatory.
That history, I mean, that's what forged his conviction.
It instilled in him this absolute refusal to submit to any system, whether it was called communist or capitalist, that required the denial of human dignity in exchange for security.
And he had a particular way of communicating this.
He spoke with this very calm, careful English. He would mix parables and scripture to articulate his warning. He taught that control doesn't arrive in a coup. He said that socialism crept in slowly, that it started with whispers of mandatory safety and shared resources, which in the end starved both the spirit and the body.
It sounds like that intensity, while completely justified by his experience, made him a really easy target for caricature by the media.
It did. The sources note that as Gabo became more focused, he let his hair and his beard grow long, and outsiders just fixated on this image. His quiet intensity was so easily twisted into the media caricature of the bearded prophet or the Cuban extremist.
Which instantly frames San Aurelio as a secretive religious cult.
Yeah.
Not an intentional community.
Precisely. Which brings us to Daniel Herrera, the architect. Now, he came from the complete opposite side of the tracks. He was born wealthy in Tampa, owned a major construction company, very successful, operated under municipal contracts. He was a pillar of the system.
Then what broke him?
Daniel's breakdown was purely internal, purely moral. His company had built a large city housing project. The project eventually collapsed, tragically, because of cheap, substandard materials that were forced on him by municipal officials who were seeking kickbacks and driving up their own profit margins.
And they covered it up.
Completely. When the collapse happened, officials blamed the structural failure on acts of God, unforeseen seismic activity, anything but their own corruption. Daniel never forgave himself for what he called the complicity of wealth. for participating in a system that prioritized profit over human life.
So his path to San Aurelio was a kind of quest for redemption then. He was blending his faith with economic theory.
Precisely. He became the philosophical backbone of the place. He was mixing Christian libertarianism, specific scripture about self-responsibility, and the severe anti-interventionism of Austrian economists like Huerta de Soto and Hayek.
So his sermons weren't about escaping reality.
No, they were about building a moral one. His core belief was crystal clear. Freedom without virtue rots, and virtue without freedom dies. And this established San Aurelio not just as a refuge, but as a place where liberty was predicated on voluntary virtue and responsibility.
Okay, so that brings us to the final two founders. The ones who ensured San Aurelio had both digital protection and, well, a constant stream of external warmth.
Right. Marcus Lee, the structure. He was a Stanford-educated tech libertarian, a real Silicon Valley golden boy who had peaked early.
In Marcus's break, it wasn't about taxes or zoning laws. It was all rooted in digital integrity.
Completely. He was disgusted by the creeping demands for control within the tech sector. He described the corporate culture as demanding multicolored homogeneity. People could look different, but they had to think, post, and comply in exactly the same way.
And what was his final line in the sand?
His company had developed an encrypted messaging app, total focus on absolute privacy. And corporate demands, which were likely influenced by state pressures, asked him to integrate a recovery key.
A backdoor.
A backdoor that would give them, and potentially federal agencies, access to all encrypted communications. He refused, outright. And he was immediately blacklisted, financially crippled, and publicly accused of building a haven for criminals.
That's where the philosophy meets the dirt then. He took that digital architecture and applied it to a physical place.
He gave the community its structural resilience, redundancy, distributed systems, backups they can't reach. That was his mantra. He saw San Aurelio as the ultimate proof of concept for his principles. His famous phrase was that San Aurelio was the blockchain made flesh.
That's a phenomenal image, but I have to ask, wasn't that analogy fundamentally, tragically flawed? I mean, a distributed network of digital ledgers is intangible. It's hard to seize.
Yeah.
A physical location, no matter how remote, is still fixed. It can be destroyed by overwhelming physical force. Did he ever address that contradiction?
And that is the friction point our sources really highlight. Marcus, in his optimism, he believed that if the physical system was built with the same level of redundancy and resistance as a distributed ledger, it would just be too complex and costly to dismantle.
He was focused on the economic metaphor.
Yes, the decentralized currency, the redundant water sources, the distributed power generation. He believed that institutional forces would eventually find it cheaper to ignore them than to crush them. Unfortunately, he miscalculated the institutional need to make an example.
And that leaves us with Jack Doyle, the Cassandra. The sources say he was mysterious, maybe an assumed name, met Sarah and Ethan at a gun range.
Jack was he was the necessary but also corrosive element of paranoia. His background is never verifiable. Was he a trucker, a former financial analyst? Maybe something else entirely.
And his obsessions were very specific.
Very. He was obsessed with what he called long cycles of history, the decline of empires, the coming fiat currency collapse. He was always talking about the 1933 gold confiscation, and he was constantly shouting warnings about the WEF C40 Soros.
He sounds like a conspiracy theorist, full stop. Yet the sources describe him as half mad, half brilliant, and eerily correct in a disturbing number of times.
He was the ultimate paradox. Jack's relentless conviction meant he was the first to show up and the last to leave. He could mix concrete one day and rewire the solar pump the next. His hard work was invaluable. But his constant aggressive warnings, documenting, for example, the specific language of global think tanks about population shifts and carbon controls, that was pure Exhibit A for the prosecution later. His presence served as proof that the community was stewing in paranoia, justifying the eventual classification of San Aurelio as a danger zone.
So that's the collective skill set and the collective trauma. A group of highly competent, deeply wounded people decides to build a fortress of their principles. Let's transition now and drill down into the mechanics of how they made San Aurelio a physical, functioning reality.
Right, because moving from defiance to construction required meticulous, unglamorous work. And the first hurdle wasn't building the walls, it was fighting what they called the paperwork war.
They chose the site of San Aurelio, this abandoned Spanish settlement that had briefly been a sugar town before the swamp just consumed it. How did they legally claim ownership without buying it?
They used adverse possession law, which is a highly technical and demanding legal strategy. In Florida, it typically requires demonstrating hostile, actual, open, notorious, and exclusive occupation for 7 years.
And you have to pay the taxes.
You have to pay the back taxes for that entire duration. You have to physically occupy the land, maintain it, improve it, and crucially, act like you're the true owner against the whole world.
That sounds like a legal nightmare. Tracking decades of defunct ownership tax liens. This is where Marcus, the coder, essentially hacked the legal system.
Absolutely. Marcus turned property law into a database problem. The county records were a historical mess. You had parcels with no listed owners, old mailboxes untouched for years, overlapping tax claims.
It was chaos.
Total chaos. And Marcus used his skills, deep searches on public ancestry sites, cross-referencing probate records, mapping property boundaries against satellite imagery, and he did it faster and more accurately than the county clerks themselves.
Give us an example of his bureaucratic genius.
Okay, so he traced one current owner who was listed on the county rolls but had actually been deceased for 8 years. Yet the taxes were still accruing.
Wow.
So by presenting the actual death certificate and showing there was no clear heir challenging their occupancy, Sarah had the precise legal leverage she needed to challenge the county's tax claim and assert their own adverse possession. Marcus was basically giving Sarah the true, uncorrupted records to wield in legal disputes. He turned the state's own inefficiency against itself.
That is the core irony, isn't it? A community built to escape the system had to be masterful at navigating that same system, at least on paper.
And digitally, they maintained their independence while ensuring they could still function. Marcus set up that solar-powered mesh network. Mesh, not hub. No single point of failure. That was his thing.
He used high-gain directional antennas hidden in the church steeple and the water tower.
Yep. He saw this as critical infrastructure independence, a technological flag of defiance. It ensured that being off-grid didn't mean being cut off from information.
But the seeds of that network's destruction were right there in its design. His effort to maintain connection was later twisted into the digital nail in their coffin.
The irony is just tragic, because the network bypassed regulated commercial carriers, it encrypted communication end-to-end, and it was instantly labeled a threat by regulators.
So the prosecution.
The prosecution later successfully twisted this distributed network designed purely for redundancy and privacy into proof of providing material support for a criminal enterprise and using untraceable communications. His code, which was designed to protect communication, was labeled a weapon of subversion. It became a central argument that encryption itself was fundamentally incompatible with state oversight.
And Sarah insisted on keeping the original name, San Aurelio. Why the historical tie rather than, choosing a name that screamed defiance?
Well, Marcus suggested Galt's Gulch, which was too obvious. Daniel had some biblical options, which were too sectarian. Sarah refused them all.
She wanted something else.
She insisted on San Aurelio to signify continuation, not erasure. It lent the project immense weight. It sounded older than the founders, rooted in the history of the region. It made them sound like settlers reclaiming a past tradition, not revolutionaries starting something entirely new.
So once that legal groundwork was laid, how did they build a functioning economy without relying on fiat currency or state institutions?
The economy was intensely organic. It was built entirely out of necessity and trust. They called it muscle currency. It wasn't planned by decree. It was voluntary exchange in its purest form.
How did it start?
Sarah began by trading raw milk from her few cows for specific labor hours. So if you spent 2 hours mucking stalls, you went home with a quart of milk and half a pound of cheese.
But what about standardization? Barter is so difficult to scale beyond just a few items.
And that's where the currency evolved. When the beekeeper arrived, high-quality honey became a staple currency. It was often used to pay Daniel's construction crew. But as the community grew, they realized they needed a unit of account that was non-perishable.
And that's where the silver came in.
They adopted silver coins, junk silver, and silver rounds as standardized hard money. And Marcus, he was delighted. He referred to it as metallic barter.
So they were using physical silver for the big transactions, but what about for day-to-day stuff, minor credit?
Exactly. The silver represented durable wealth, savings. But for daily operational credit, they had this sophisticated system of IOUs that lined the wall of the old post office.
Yes, handwritten notes.
Handwritten notes representing work promised or resources borrowed. It showed this incredibly high level of community trust based on reputation and proximity. and this level of self-contained monetary management that deeply, deeply troubled federal regulators later on.
So how is order maintained? No police force, no city council, no centralized judicial power. How did that work?
Governance was handled entirely through moral authority and voluntary cooperation. The only real punishment was loss of reputation.
Which meant what, exactly?
It meant loss of credit on that IOU wall and eventually social exclusion. Conflict resolution was managed by the figures of deepest moral authority. Our sources cite this really powerful anecdote.
What happened?
Two young men started fighting violently over a girl one evening, and Gabo stepped between them completely unarmed. He stopped the fight, not with physical force, but by quietly reminding them, "Nothing chains a man more than hate. We are here to be free." That quiet moral strength, that was the law of San Aurelio.
So for the casual observer reading these sensational media reports, San Aurelio was just an armed separatist training camp.
Oh.
But what was the texture of daily life inside?
Rachel Kim's notes are just invaluable here. She contrasts the official narrative with the reality on the ground. Life was defined by the rhythm of hammers, the intense Florida heat, the smell of wood smoke, and just relentless, exhausting work.
That sounds ordinary.
It was ordinary life. People ate together at this long, rough-hewn table, sharing whatever the garden or the hunt provided. There were gardens, arguments, shared laughter. But it was all framed by this extraordinary collective conviction.
The sources highlight two key non-ideological events that really cemented the fact that they were building a future, not just resisting a past. The first was the wedding.
Yes, Daniel officiated the first wedding under the skeleton of the half-finished meeting hall. And his entire sermon, it focused on covenant and voluntary cooperation. He framed marriage not as a contract enforced by the state, but as a freely chosen bond.
And Gabo added something to that.
He did. He reinforced it with his cultural insight. He said, "Love, like freedom, is never imposed." It was a celebration of chosen bonds over state mandates.
And then the birth.
The first child born in San Aurelio, that was the ultimate confirmation of their success. The baby immediately became everyone's child. Women passed him from arm to arm. Men worked late into the night building this beautifully carved crib out of scrap pine.
It changed things.
It changed everything. Rachel wrote in her diary, "We stopped building for ourselves. We started building for them." It cemented the fact that San Aurelio was building a lineage, a durable future, not just a temporary fort.
And this is where the conversation shifts. Because while the community was focused on births and weddings, the outside world was focused on tax collectors, leaving empty-handed and frustrated. That resistance, combined with the presence of hard currency, that's where the narrative turns sinister.
Exactly. This transition shows how institutional forces, having failed to beat San Aurelio on procedural or bureaucratic grounds, thanks to Marcus and Sarah, turned to narrative warfare to justify later kinetic intervention.
The first major physical confrontation, it involved county inspectors arriving and demanding property taxes, plus interest and penalties. The community, standing on their adverse possession claims, they just refused to pay.
And the escalation it was controlled but devastatingly effective. Ethan stepped forward to confront the officials. He didn't shout. He maintained this unnerving calm, and he deliberately shouldered his rifle and chambered around.
A declarative gesture.
Purely declarative, worse than shouting. And he said simply, "I say this conversation is over. You are trespassing." And others nearby, mostly men who had trained with him, just placed their hands on their own weapons. It emphasized the point without another word.
And then came the moment that birthed the legend. The senior county clerk, rattled, defeated, he lingered near Ethan. He tried to offer a bribe. When that failed, he leaned in.
He leans in and warns, "We know you've got reserves," and his eyes flick clearly toward the ground.
That was it.
Rachel Kim's interview confirms this was the absolute spark of the gold vault myth. The county officials themselves, unable to extract taxes or compliance, fueled the rumor of hidden untaxable wealth as a way of retribution and justification.
And Jack Doyle's constant warnings about gold revaluation and financial collapse, that just poured gasoline on the fire.
It reinforced the official lie with an ideological veneer, so suddenly the community's completely legal bulk deliveries of silver coins and their purchase of simple home safes were immediately amplified.
From metallic barter
to truckloads of bullion and a massive Fort Knox-style underground vault.
And once the world believed they were hoarding immense untaxed wealth, it transformed them from principled settlers into greedy criminals.
Exactly. It made them an irresistible target for federal agencies interested in seizure. The institutional need to rationalize hostility required a target more tangible than an abstract argument over voluntary cooperation. They needed the treasure of San Aurelio.
How did local perceptions, which seemed largely favorable at first, change compared to the rising national media hysteria?
The contrast is significant. Locally, the surrounding townspeople, they remember the San Aurelio residents as polite, hardworking, fair traders. They bought their honey, their goat milk, their eggs. But the locals did grow genuinely uneasy about the volume of arms and the constant visible security drills Ethan implemented. They saw the guns up close, and it made them nervous.
The national media, though, had zero time for nuance.
None. They immediately declared them off-grid cooks, tax-dodging cult, purveyors of cyber-squatter fantasies. The reporting was deliberately unnuanced. It relied on stock footage of masked men and armored vehicles, sometimes not even from Florida, to frame the narrative as inherently violent and sinister.
And while the media was building that public case, the bureaucratic war began in Washington. What do the internal Dealshay and Treasury memos tell us about the institutional viewpoint?
The internal memos are chilling. They're chilling in their clinical assessment. They framed San Aurelio not as a local tax issue, but as a troubling precedent, attempting de facto governance.
And Treasury was worried about the silver.
Treasury officials worried openly about the use of silver in the IOU system. They called it a potential economic contagion that could spread to other discontented, self-reliant communities. The explicit mandate contained in one memo was that San Aurelio must be made an example to stop this economic descent from taking root.
The motivation was compliance, not public safety.
Clearly. And so if they couldn't attack the finances legally, how did they justify intervention to the public?
The children.
They leveraged the most powerful emotional tool available, the children. Education representatives issued these reports noting unregulated curricula, the lack of state testing, children being cut off from civic norms. This "think of the children" refrain was a powerful, morally unassailable line used to justify federal intervention where disputes over property law might have failed to secure public backing.
Which led directly to the silent siege.
Wow.
The gradual bureaucratic strangulation of the community. What were the specific details of that siege?
It was a methodical campaign of nonviolent pressure. Federal lobbying resulted in cell providers refusing service, citing service area restrictions, which was an obvious coordinated lie.
And delivery stopped.
UPS and FedEx ceased all deliveries. So the community was suddenly cut off from medical supplies, specific machine parts, bulk diesel, propane. Marcus noted bitterly that they weren't fighting people who wanted to shoot them, but people who decided they didn't deserve to use the global system.
How did the community adapt to that critical loss of modern infrastructure?
They reverted, and rapidly, to older technologies. They resurrected an old shortwave radio for external information. They switched entirely to wood-fired heating and cooking.
And when the generator ran out of fuel?
When the diesel generator ran dry, Gabo gathered everyone. He lit a kerosene lantern, a symbolic return to pre-electric reliance, and declared, "They want us to fear the dark. But the dark is ours. We will teach our children to fear dependence, not the shadows." They were being systematically starved and isolated, and it proved the vulnerability of Marcus's blockchain-made-flesh philosophy.
This overwhelming external pressure clearly took a severe internal toll. What evidence do we have of that rising siege mentality?
Ethan escalated the defense. It went from deterrence to preparation for actual conflict. He and Jack pooled what was left of their savings to purchase 2.50 caliber rifles. And he acknowledged the grim reality. He said, "If this gets ugly, it won't be fair, but they will remember us." The presence of those rifles was purely symbolic, psychological. It was intended to deter overwhelming force. The armed watchmen increased their rotation schedules from 4 hours to 3, straining everyone's energy.
And maybe the most poignant and tragic sign of the hardening was the erosion of innocence among the children.
Rachel's private notes document this in just heartbreaking detail. Children's games changed from tag or hide and seek to these complex, organized games of raid. They'd shout mock orders and use sticks as toy rifles.
That's awful.
She wrote that the final moment of realization came when she overheard a 7-year-old instructing his sister during a game of defense. He said, "Daddy will shoot them first." The community was no longer building a future of peace. They were training the next generation for a war they hadn't started.
In the face of that despair, Gabo made his final, morally definitive move. He offered them a choice to leave.
He gathered everyone in the half-finished meeting hall. He knew the siege was intensifying. He looked at them and stated plainly, "I won't judge anyone who goes. I have seen the state break people not with guns, but with despair. Don't stay if you don't mean it."
And people left.
People did leave, quietly. Mostly families with very young children or those whose commitment was primarily economic. And their departure made the town, in Rachel's words, thinner and more brittle. It removed the margin for error and strengthened the remaining core of hardliners.
So the internal spirit was brittle, the external narrative was locked in place, and the tension was just unbearable. All that was missing was the flimsiest external lie to trigger the catastrophe.
And the final sequence of events just demonstrates the devastating speed with which a bureaucratic decision, fueled by a manufactured narrative, led to an irreversible, lethal catastrophe.
The pretext for the final, full-scale federal intervention was flimsy at best. An incident where a nervous delivery driver claimed he was spooked by armed men on a back road. These suspects were never identified, never located, never connected to San Aurelio.
That minor incident was immediately amplified. An internal, handwritten note on the sheriff's report, later revealed in the investigation, read, "This is the pretext we need. Escalate."
Chilling.
A Justice Department official seized upon it, transforming the local scare into national news. A paramilitary ambush, blocking interstate commerce and threatening public safety. This elevated the perceived threat level beyond local law enforcement capability.
And the situation was complicated by the political stance of the Florida governor at the time, who inserted state autonomy into the whole equation.
The governor publicly spoke up for the community. He urged caution, stating they were Floridians, they deserved due process. He criticized the heavy hand of federal intervention and the media's sensationalism.
But that backfired.
It infuriated Washington. The feeling in the DOJ was that the governor was enabling sedition. It made San Aurelio an even bigger target because the federal government felt compelled to reassert primacy over state authority.
So the trap was sprung. ATF and county patrol vehicles approached, citing an investigation into unlawful firearms possession, a charge that was predictable, but clearly a preemptive strike.
GPS logs later placed them half a mile from the town limits. And Gabo, committed to nonviolence until the very end, he stepped forward, hands open, unarmed, to meet the agents. His last recorded words to the approaching convoy were, "You boys are a long way from home. We mean you no harm."
This is the critical juncture where history just becomes blurred by chaos, by political necessity, by conflicting testimony. Gabo met the agents, but accounts disagree violently on who fired the shot that broke the truce.
They do. Federal reports insisted the San Aurelio perimeter fired first. However, multiple surviving witnesses, including Rachel Kim, consistently reported hearing a single, isolated, high-pitched shot coming from behind the federal line, not from the community's position.
So it could have been an accidental discharge.
The source material suggests a nervous agent twitched near a trigger, or possibly an accidental discharge occurred under immense tension. But regardless of intent, the immediate consequence was devastating.
An ATF officer fell.
An ATF officer fell. Whether struck by that isolated shot or an accidental injury in the confusion, it remains officially unconfirmed. But the immediate radio call of "Officer down" sealed the entire federal response. From that moment forward, the narrative was fixed.
He was an ambush.
San Aurelio was no longer a tax issue or a self-governance issue. It was designated a violent ambush against federal law enforcement.
With that designation, the FBI assumed control, and the siege tactics began in earnest.
They implemented overwhelming psychological warfare. Loudspeakers broadcast these constant, repetitive warnings of surrender, alternating with dissonant, jarring music. It was a calculated assault on the nerves designed to erode the community's cohesion.
And Gabo refused to surrender.
Despite the rising despair, he refused. He maintained that the people would only leave if and when they wanted to, protecting their voluntary agreement to remain.
The final assault involved overwhelming kinetic force.
Tanks were rolled in, specifically military surplus vehicles, to demonstrate overwhelming force and deny any possibility of breakout. And the post office, which was serving as the designated shelter for women and children, was targeted.
What did they do?
They drilled holes into the thick pine walls and pumped canisters of CS gas inside. Authorities maintained it was non-lethal, but it created immediate choking panic.
And the tragic end came in fire, consuming the very structure that represented the community's trust and economy.
In the horrific chaos caused by the gas and the incoming fire, a kerosene lamp, one of the symbols of their self-reliance, toppled. The flames consumed the dry pine and quickly engulfed the post office.
And Gabo.
Gabo was shot and fell, carrying two of the youngest children out through a broken window. He spent his final moments honoring his moral covenant by saving others. Daniel Herrera, the architect, he perished in the flames, burned beyond recognition. The great irony is that he was consumed by the very element he sought to conquer by building a durable community.
And Jack Doyle, the Cassandra.
Jack vanished. Neither his body nor a single verifiable witness to his fate was ever recovered. To the state, he was the coward who ran. To the sympathizers, he was the folk hero who slipped the state's grasp, fueling the enduring legend that the true treasure wasn't bullion, but escape itself. Ethan and Marcus were captured, covered in ash and defeat, their faces immediately broadcast across every national network.
The media spectacle, featuring those images of tanks and crying children running from smoke, it continued long after the fires were out. What was the institutional verdict on the operation?
The Commission's final report was an almost perfect institutional whitewash. It characterized the operational failure and the casualties as unintended consequences and miscommunication, clearing all federal agencies of wrongdoing. The language was clinical, bloodless, designed to minimize responsibility and maximize the public perception that the tragedy was unavoidable.
Because of the extremists.
Exactly. And this brings us to the most legally devastating tactic used against the survivors: the weaponization of the felony murder rule. This is a concept that you really have to understand this to see how they did it.
Drilling down into the records, what do we find? How did the prosecution use this rule to secure convictions when there was no definitive proof that the surviving founders had personally fired the fatal shot?
The felony murder rule is brutal in its simplicity. The prosecution successfully argued that because an officer died during the initial confrontation and because the community had conspired to obstruct federal justice and resist law enforcement, an underlying felony, all participants in that conspiracy bore equal guilt for the resulting murder.
So intent to kill was irrelevant.
Irrelevant. The fatal argument was that by agreeing to the self-governance model and possessing arms, they had knowingly joined a conspiracy whose foreseeable outcome was violence. Simply living there was participation enough.
Let's run down the specific verdicts because they highlight how the state targeted their competence and their ideologies.
Ethan Brooks, the military muscle, the frontline resistor, was sentenced to 40 years for felony murder. Sarah Whitfield, the logistical backbone, the intellectual founder, she received 25 years for felony murder. She died in prison years later. The pressure of confinement just destroyed the woman who was built for growth and resilience.
And Marcus Lee, the coder, Stanford Golden Boy, what was the legal precedent set by his conviction?
Marcus received 10 years for conspiracy to obstruct and material support for a criminal enterprise. And this is the key legal insight from modern times. The prosecution successfully argued that his encrypted code and his principles of digital independence, his mesh network, his ability to manage identity and documents outside of state view were collectively a weapon of subversion.
So technology designed to evade state oversight was declared intrinsically hostile.
And therefore criminal. That was the judge's ruling.
Finally, Jack Doyle tried in absentia.
The warrant for felony murder and conspiracy remains active. His disappearance, as we noted, it just fueled the myth. And legally, his status secured the prosecution's argument that at least one of the original conspirators successfully evaded justice, justifying the severity of the sentences applied to the others.
San Aurelio became a permanent, charred symbol in American history.
It did. To critics, it remains proof of dangerous extremism, fueled by paranoia and tax dodging. It's a cautionary tale that centralization is necessary for security. To sympathizers, it's a warning carved in fire, a reminder that a community defined by voluntary exchange and independence was crushed simply for daring to challenge centralized authority, and that the state will invent the motive, the gold vault, if the real one, the desire for freedom, is insufficient to justify intervention.
So what does this entire tragic story mean for us now, 2 decades later?
The central tragedy of San Aurelio, it's rooted in this fundamental contradiction. A community built on trust and voluntary exchange was undone by a self-fulfilling prophecy. Institutional officials, unable to tolerate peaceful dissent, manufactured the gold vault rumor because they needed a concrete material motive to justify using tanks.
Right.
And the institutional response proved, unequivocally, that the state views genuine, comprehensive self-sufficiency, economic, digital, and physical, as an existential threat. As that economic contagion, that must be eradicated, regardless of how peaceful its genesis.
We began this deep dive with the legend of the treasure of San Aurelio, young men still digging in the ruins for bullion.
And the author, after years of forensic investigation, concluded that the actual existence of any massive vault was irrelevant to the final outcome. The real treasure was never metal. It was the blueprint, the detailed, if flawed, attempt to create a perfect voluntary society. It was the lessons they left behind about freedom, about the creeping nature of fear, and that razor-thin, politically defined line between building a community and organizing a conspiracy.
So we have to ask ourselves this final provocative thought. Could San Aurelio happen again today? If a group of highly educated, ideologically committed people chose to build a self-sufficient, private, and voluntary community, maybe using modern crypto or decentralized finance rather than metallic barter, what is the line between self-sufficiency and rebellion in the eyes of the government now? And how long would it take before the whispers of a shadow economy or a digital vault begin, forcing the same inevitable confrontation? That is the real legacy of San Aurelio.